Okay, good evening. I'm Alon Confino. I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you on this International Day of Remembering the Holocaust. Tonight, this evening, we are going to have a conversation with Avinoam Patt and Shternshis on Laughter After, Humor and the Holocaust, a book edited by David Slucki, Gabriel and Avinoam Patt. Let me say a few housekeeping things. I'll present then our two speakers, and we'll start. So the Institute is on Facebook and has an email list that can be subscribed. You can write it in the chat, or you can send us an email. All the events, including this one, is being recorded and is added to the virtual library of the Institute. At the end of our conversation, which will take about 40 minutes, we are going to have a Q&A. Please write your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom, not at the chat. That's it. Shternshis is the Al and Malka Green Professor of Yiddish Studies and Director of the Ann Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. Her last book is When Sonia Met Boris, an oral history of Jewish life under Stalin, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. Together with artist Psoy Korolenko, Anna created and directed the Grammy-nominated Yiddish Glory Project, an initiative that brought back to life forgotten Yiddish music written during the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. A recipient of 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship, she is currently working on a book tentatively entitled Last Yiddish Heroes, a lost and found archive of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union about Yiddish music created in Nazi-occupied Ukraine. Avinoam Patt is the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. Together with David Slucki and Gabi Finder, is the editor of the book that we are discussing today, which looks like this, and recently completed a new book on the early post-war remembrance of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, entitled The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of the Revolt, published by Wayne State University Press a few months ago. He is also the co-editor of the recent volume, Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. So we are going to start with Avinoam, who will tell us a few general things about the book, and then the three of us will have a conversation about what does it mean to think and to laugh about the Holocaust and with the Holocaust. And then we'll open up the floor for discussion. Avinoam, please.
Okay, Alon, thank you so much for having us here. And I want to thank the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass. And it's so nice to see Anna Shternshis also online, although I'm sure we would all agree it'd be much more fun to be together in person. So I want to thank you for hosting us for this program today, for this discussion in conjunction with International Holocaust Remembrance Day, today, January 27th, 77 years, I guess, after the liberation of Auschwitz now. So I have a few things that I wanted to share in our discussion. And so I'm going to share my screen, just some food for thought as we engage with this topic of laughter after humor and the Holocaust. And here you can see a few images of some topics that might come up in the course of our discussion now. I'm sure Larry David may come up, perhaps Jojo Rabbit, certainly Mel Brooks, and the other images, maybe I'll have a chance to explain what they are. But I also want to acknowledge how unusual it might seem for us to be having a program in conjunction with International Holocaust Remembrance Day that deals with the topic of humor, because here we are gathered on a very solemn day of remembrance, and yet it might seem strange that we are discussing the topic of humor, which does not seem as serious of a topic. So I thought I would start actually with a joke, if that's okay. And this is a joke that I first read in Steve Lippman's collection, Laughter in Hell. So it goes like this. Hitler, not being a religious man, was inclined to consult his astrologers about the future. As the tide of the war worsened, he asked, "Am I going to lose the war?" Answered affirmatively, he then asked, "Well, am I going to die?" Consulting their charts, the astrologers again said yes. "When am I going to die?" was Hitler's next question. This time, the answer was, "You're going to die on a Jewish holiday." "But when? On what Jewish holiday?" he asked with agitation. The reply, "Any day you die will be a Jewish holiday." So I thought this would be a good starting point for us to engage with our discussion of when we invoke humor in discussions of the Holocaust, because certainly in the immediate aftermath of the war, the liberation, we already see this celebration of the death of the modern day Haman in the form of Hitler being celebrated by Jews, for example, here in Landsberg, displaced persons camp, the first Purim, which was celebrated after the war. And as I'm sure Anna will reference in some of her remarks, we know that there's a very long tradition of invoking humor in the context of responding to persecution, certainly a long history of Jewish responses to persecution, which deal with humor. But working together with my co-editors on this volume, Laughter After Humor in the Holocaust, my friends David Slucki and Gabriel Finder and myself, we thought it was high time, some 20 years after the appearance of Life is Beautiful, to take stock of the really proliferation of representations of humor and discussions of the Holocaust, and for us to think seriously about what the boundaries of what we consider to be appropriate and inappropriate are when we think about the Holocaust. And this was a starting off point for us to begin to edit this volume, which came together as a collection, a very, I think, serious collection of work by a wonderful international array of scholars dealing with what we can see is a very serious topic, that is how and when humor has been used to respond to persecution, has been used when to respond to not only the Holocaust, but to the memory of the Holocaust itself. So Anna's chapter, which we will hear about, deals with invocations of humor in the aftermath of the Holocaust, both during and then after the war. And there are many wonderful chapters that deal with breaking taboos and thinking about how boundaries in terms of how humor is represented and thinking about the Holocaust have shifted over time, especially in the last 20 years. And comparisons, and I think one of the strengths of the volume is comparisons in an international framework, looking at the use of humor in discussions of the Holocaust in places like the United States, of course, but Canada, Latin America, Israel, Germany, Australia, and America. And the chapter that I write, I'd be happy to talk about this more, looks at comparing Israeli and American sketch comedy that invokes the Holocaust. Now, certainly we know that Jewish humor itself emerges from, in many cases, one of the explanatory frameworks for the emergence of Jewish humor is that it is a type of a defense mechanism that Jews invoke. A people with such a long history of persecution use that humor to neutralize the hostility of the outside world by internalizing it, and then by detonating it through a joke, as we can see here in Hillel Halkin's explanation of Jewish humor. And I would say, just in wrapping up, that we can see many different forms of humor used in the context of the Holocaust. In the volume itself, we talk about humor that is used as a weapon against anti-Semitism and Nazism. We also see humor being used by Jews both during and after the war to process the recent traumas of the war, to cope with the enormity of the destruction, and to reflect on the seemingly absurd nature of continued Jewish life after the Holocaust. After the war, we see humor, in particular, humor directed at non-Jewish audiences, that uses humor as a weapon to minimize and belittle Nazis. And I think Mel Brooks is probably the most famous case of this, although we've seen many, many examples of this. But what I find particularly interesting is that in recent decades, we've seen as the place of the Holocaust has grown in contemporary Jewish life and culture, we've seen references to the Holocaust in Jewish humor in increasingly frequent ways. That is, jokes that might use the Holocaust as a backdrop to tell jokes about other topics. And I think this is a type of Holocaust humor that's substantively different in its form and agenda. It's not using humor as a coping mechanism. It's not using humor as a weapon against Nazis. In many cases, it's very, very political. And in fact, it is using humor to critique the centrality of the Holocaust in contemporary forms of Jewish politics, identity, and wider society. At the same time, and I think a number of the contributors to this volume make this case very convincingly, we have to take seriously the place of humor in the broader Holocaust memorial landscape. That is that the ways in which we use humor to also remember the Holocaust, but also to situate it in a broader framework of Jewish memory. So I'm going to stop myself there and thank you again, Alon, for hosting us, and I'm very happy to turn it over to Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Avi. It's great to see you here, and thank you, Alon, for inviting me. Although I think, Alon, I'm turning the microphone to you rather than to myself because you're launching the discussion, right? I'm happy to tell you about my chapter and stuff, but I think it would be good to start this conversation.
Okay, so I actually thought, Anna, of asking you to tell us a little bit about your chapter in the book, which is about humor and violence in Yiddish folklore in the Soviet Union immediately after the war. And particularly, so how people conceived of their jokes about the Holocaust. Was it a taboo? Was it a defense mechanism? All of the above. Were the jokes funny?
Yeah.
If you can tell us.
I have to watch what I say because Avi just told us not to say that it's defense mechanism or a weapon, right? So
all of the above, right?
Exactly.
I better stick to the right framework here. But I do want to say that I'm interested in Yiddish culture created during the Holocaust. And I never ever set to study the humor. It was not my goal to study jokes or to study humor. But to be honest, I couldn't not do it because humor was jumping at me from everywhere I went. And to give you the context of things that I've studied, that statement is even more shocking than I say it out loud. I was studying experiences of Jews who were living and dying in ghettos in Transnistria. This is the part of contemporary Ukraine and Moldova. The people were dying from starvation, from typhus, from sometimes actions of mass murder every single day. And in those conditions, they created songs. The reason why I found those songs is because right after the war, Soviet Jewish ethnomusicologist Moisei Bergovsky traveled in some of those areas of Ukraine, found survivors, a lot of them children, and recorded their songs. Later, Bergovsky went to Gulag for this work for fostering Jewish nationalism. The songs and the jokes survived in the Ukrainian archive, in the Ukrainian National Library. So I come to study those songs. I didn't come to study humor. And then I'm writing an article, not the article in the volume, but I'll come back to this in 30 seconds. I'm writing an article about songs of Bershed ghetto. Bershed was one of the largest ghettos in Transnistria, 20,000 people, but there are 15,000 deported from nearby Romania, 5,000 local Jews. People are dying every single day there, usually from cold and from typhus. And there are some talented poets there, usually young people, writing songs. And after the war, Bergovsky records those songs from a number of kids. So it's a wonderful insight in that everyday life. So I'm writing an article about this, and I want to find, in my head, I divided this material into, this is going to be about daily life, this is going to be about loss, this is going to be about anger, and this is going to be about something else. And I can't write this article because every single song I study is humorous. And it's humorous on different things. Some of it is satire, some of it is self-deprecation, some of it is anger, almost always directed to other Jews. So the relationship between Romanian Jews and Ukrainian Jews in those ghettos were terrible. Romanian Jews, were put in positions of power, heads of Judenrat and all this, in charge of distribution of food. So all these Ukrainian Jews are writing devastating satires towards those people. They also laugh at themselves, how thin they became, how ugly they became. And they talk about this out loud. So a little bit of satire towards Germans, but they don't see those Germans. Those are really far away. They're laughing at each other. So everything I touch, typhus, starvation, everyday death, violence, even rape, all that is through the lens of humor. And what I want to say about this, like when we say Holocaust and humor, everyone worries about this. Are we going to say something wrong? Are we going to talk about the topic we're not supposed to talk about? But if we start thinking about what humor actually is in our everyday life, we know three things about it. First of all, humor is not translatable. If I tell you a Russian joke, even in my perfect English, chances are you won't find it funny because humor is very hard to translate. Second, it's not movable. If I go to Russia right now, I lived there the last 25 years ago. If I turn on TV comedy show, I will not find anything funny. I know you will, sympathize with that because if you leave the place, you don't get the humor later. And also it ages terribly. Jokes that are funny to us now will not be funny or incomprehensible to the next generation. If you doubt it, talk to your children and see if they find you funny, So if we know those three things, and then we put this in the context of the Holocaust, then suddenly if we find jokes or humor, then it gives us this precious insight of what made people laugh in those conditions and what entertained them and what was relevant to them. So in my view, it's impossible to study any historical event, let alone an event like a Holocaust, where so many sources come to us written by perpetrators, and we're looking for those stories and experiences by victims. If we find humor, that's a real gold and that's a real insight. And my chapter in the volume deals with that humor that was created by Jewish refugees, mostly Polish Jewish refugees who survived the war in Kazakhstan. And that's where Purim comes to be and a lot of other things. So I'll just stop for now.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about taboo. Are there taboos when we think about the Holocaust? I think that they are, philosophically, there are not taboos within humor. I mean, you can do everything, but I wonder whether there has been taboo or there have been taboos. If yes, what were they? Maybe for the people who experienced the Holocaust, there were less taboo than for us, because if you are part of it, you feel also entitled or legitimate. You have the right to laugh at your own suffering. While if you are if you do it in hindsight, it's more complicated. So how is the question of taboo enter this conversation? Avinoam, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, I'll start. And I think it's a really interesting question, and it's one of the reasons we wanted to put together this volume, because it's something that there's constantly shifting boundaries in terms of what we consider taboo, especially with a topic as difficult for us to think about and to consider when we think about humor and the Holocaust. I think there's the issue of audience and intent, right? So those are two ways to think about how we determine what is taboo. Because I think one of the issues with Holocaust humor as well, so as you suggested, it depends who's telling the joke, right? It's one thing for victims or survivors who are there to invoke certain kinds of humor, which is very different from those who are not there, right? So there is an issue with that. I think the issue of audience is also serious. So there are, one of the things that I find very interesting in my work comparing sort of comedy or humor about the Holocaust in Israel and America, there are jokes and performances that are done in Israel, which would be considered very dark, very much sort of a gallows humor that's not taboo at all, that here in an American context just would be shocking, right? So, I'm thinking about a sketch that was on Eretz Nehederet that I write about in the book, Mr. Reality, who situates a reality TV show in a concentration camp and asks people to decide, do they want to be Jews or Nazis? I mean, it's sort of like completely shocking even to think about it, but this is on television, right? This, I don't think we would have here in the United States. So it's interesting to think about the boundaries. We have a lot of examples that we talk about in the book. One that comes up a couple of times is, for example, Larry David, right, as a comedian, as a performer, is very interested. Like, the job of the humorist, of the performer, is to think about what are those boundaries, what are the things we say and we can't say, and why can't we say them? So he took a lot of flack for a monologue that he did on Saturday Night Live in 2017, when he, told a joke that he's situated in a concentration camp, thinking about, would he still be interested in trying to pick up women in a concentration camp? What type of pickup lines would he use? There's no good pickup lines in a concentration camp. And it fell completely flat because I think there's a real distinction between sort of the boundary there is trying to think about at what point is the humor making fun of the victims, as opposed to the humor that we talked about that's making fun of Nazis, right? Or making fun of memory, right? So it's interesting then to think about what doesn't work and what becomes taboo. Some comedians will say nothing is taboo, right? My job is to explore and find the boundaries, and nothing is taboo. I'm curious what you think. I don't know.
I'm so happy I don't have to be a comedian, because honestly, deciding what's offensive, what's not offensive, it's such an unthankful task. But I'm very happy to be an ethnographer in that sense, and looking like you do, Avi, as well, into, what entertains the audience and why. And I agree with you that I think most of this Holocaust humor is actually laughing at the process of commemoration itself. Oh my goodness, I want to make a joke now, but I'm thinking, is this appropriate joke or not? But I'll say it anyway. I was just talking to a friend of mine, and he said, like January 27th is for Holocaust historians, honestly, like we're as busy as Santa on Christmas, because every day or every hour of the day there's a commemoration thing. Is it breaking a taboo? Is it is it appropriate? It's not appropriate. So I think there's a lot of humor that kind of makes fun of those events and those processes. But I would also say that sometimes humor that was circulating in conditions of ghettos becomes really offensive in the conditions of 21st century. So I wanted to show you something. Alon told me that I should show this video, so he hasn't seen what's on it. So if you don't like it, you just tell me. So I want to show you a video. A performer, Yefim Alexandrov, who's performing in Moscow in 2004. This is one of the largest, I think, ever, largest concert of Yiddish music. And you'll see the number of people on stage and the audience and all this. And you will see the song that he is singing. I will just show you the first 2 minutes of it, maybe a minute and a half, and then I will tell you what it is. So pay attention to what actors are dressed as on stage, and maybe read the little subtitles too. So let's see. I think you got a sense of what you've seen. The subtitles were clear, and the actors dressed as Hasidic Jews with all their payas and all the outfits are there, and the words are there. If you have money, everyone loves you. So on the first glance, we watch this. First, we admire, wow, like the production, 150 people on stage singing a Yiddish song. What's with that? Palace of Kremlin, I think that's the venue. But then we think about what is these lyrics? What is it? Song about money. If you have money, everyone respects you and loves you. Classic anti-Semitic trope. Forget the Holocaust. Like this is the classic anti-Semitic thing. So Yefim Alexandrov, was, needless to say, is a Jewish performer, one of the biggest popularizers of Yiddish music. So how does it make sense? So it makes it even better, actually. So his father, Boris Zitzerman, wrote this song when he was a prisoner in a ghetto in Transnistria. He was in Bershit ghetto. He was 15 years old. And this song is a comment on corruption of the ghetto leadership. So what he's talking about is that how, people who could bribe ghetto leadership, they get away with things. This is what the song is about. Boris Zitzerman was Yefim Alexandrov consultant on the performance. And for him, those Jews dressed in religious garb, they represented those Romanian Jews in ghetto who were more religious, more in positions of power, and were perceived as more corrupt because they had those authority there. So what do we do with this material? If we look at it without knowing the context of it, we dismiss it as what those Russians know about, Jewish culture, perpetuating, stereotypes. But if we do know the context of it and thinking about this as a ghetto song, as a song, humorous song, popular song, social commentary, then suddenly we'll look at this with completely different eyes, and it also helps us understand some of the hostile attitudes that, some of the Russian Jews shared towards religious Jews and towards religious observances in general. So I think the thinking about what's allowed, what's not allowed, actually could handicap us in how far we pursue science. And I think that would be a shame if we just don't go ahead and study this material as in depth as it deserves.
I agree, and I think that we are scholars of perceptions and sensibilities, and we follow our sources, and we follow our historical actors. And if they laughed, it had some meanings, and we have to explain it, even if, as Anna said, we don't get the joke, because it happened 70 years ago, but there are no limits to what scholars should do. I would like to ask you whether you think we can draw some kind of a roadmaps of Holocaust humor after 1945. Of course, it depends on the country and on the region and what are we speaking about, but how has Holocaust humor changed from the post-war period to now? Are there some special events that we can mark? I can think, say, of the last generation. Benini's film was very important. Now Jojo Rabbit, but so can we draw a history? We are historians. We like to historicize. That's basically my question. Can we draw some periods and how it changed and how each period perhaps influenced what came after?
I'll start, and then I want to hear what Anna has to say. I think this is a great question, Alon, and I think there's a number of threads that we can draw upon here. And it might, one of the interesting things when we analyze humor is we're sort of looking at cultural, in this case, cultural responses to the Holocaust, and it might also teach us quite a bit about how different societies have responded to the Holocaust over time. So we're essentially sort of tracing this process over time. And it could be a very fruitful way to explore this interaction. So I think, one of the questions that comes up and in the volume and in some other work that I've written about is, looking at sort of Jewish humor during and after the war. So for Jews in Europe, there's an interesting question, which is we know about the rich tradition of Jewish humor that existed before the war. And we've talked about the ways in which Jews rely upon humor during the war to respond to persecution. There's a question, does the Holocaust do anything to change Jewish humor? Or do Jews sort of fall back upon existing patterns to respond to the threat that confronts them and sort of use humor to respond? And certainly if you look at humor in Europe during and after the war, it's the same, right? So you have the same patterns of sort of how Jews respond to persecution, the coping mechanisms that we've talked about that we can see deployed, for example, in the DP camps after the war, and Mark Kaplan's chapter on post-war Poland. You can see these patterns. What's interesting is to then follow the journeys of certain survivors, and let's call it sort of a Holocaust survivor diaspora, into the broader world, and see if we can then trace the lineage of the interaction of this type of sort of humor of survivors as it interacts with the world around them. And I think that tells us a lot then about the ways in which survivors, and the very interesting work that's been done about the reception of survivors in the countries they end up in, tells us a lot about the ways in which those, if it's Israel, if it's America, if it's Australia, wherever it is, the ways in which they were able to or not able to engage with knowing what had really happened there. And I think, in the American context, right, like you can look at, for example, the use of satire as a weapon. So, Charlie Chaplin and The Great Dictator, or To Be or Not to Be when it comes out during the war. Mel Brooks and the producers, was at the time very controversial, right? Major turning point we can think about. 50 years later, when it's a Broadway musical, it seems quaint, right? It's not sort of, so it's interesting to see how these things change over time. The last thing I'll say, and that I find interesting in the Israeli context, there's a show that I write about, which some people might be familiar with, Ayudim Baim, the Jews are coming. And it's a wonderful sketch comedy show that engages with many aspects of Jewish history, and also with the Holocaust. And I think one of the interesting things, because for a long time there was an idea that sort of Israeli humor stood outside the sort of longer history of Jewish humor, right? Or that there was a stereotype that Israelis were so serious they weren't funny, right? And I think one of the interesting things that we can debunk that myth, but that the creators of the show do, there's a lot of sketches that invoke the Holocaust in that show, Hayudim Ba'im, and they're essentially reintegrating Israeli humor into the broader framework of Jewish humor, saying, we as Israelis do not stand outside of Jewish history. We are part of a longer trend of Jewish history. You know, it's not sort of the Zionist idea of, Shlilat Gola, the negation of the diaspora. We're part of this diaspora history, and Jewish humor is our humor, and we have to use this to engage with the Jewish past, not avoid the Jewish past. So I'll stop myself there, but go ahead, Anna.
Well, I have to say that it took me a very long time after, leaving the old country to understand what is this Holocaust humor. I mean, I grew up in a Soviet Union where there was no public discussion of the Holocaust. When I lived there, I left in the 1990s. Like if the war didn't exist, there were no ceremonies, no commemorations. It was something that people talked about behind closed doors, whispering about family members killed and all this. So when I came to the States for the first time, turned on TV and saw Mel Brooks, oh my God, I found it so offensive. And until today, I can't force myself to laugh at Mel Brooks. I'm sorry, Avi, if this, this goes against American religion, or American Jewish humor, or even Larry David, who my American-born husband loves and worships, I would say. I mean, I don't know, when he touches Holocaust, I don't know. And I just showed you the Beersheba ghetto humor, you know what I mean? So I get it. And I think regional thing is the key here. So if I start thinking about Russia today and Holocaust humor, we're still not there because we just have to still get to, I don't know, commemoration, to discussion, thinking about what happened and this kind of reconciliation. So I think humor is the next step. When the society is more comfortable discussing things like this. But I do want to say about regional differences during the war to take us away a little bit from from contemporary context or even post-war context. So I've been looking into this in quite a bit of depth and thinking about what Jews in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan find funny versus what Jews under the occupation find funny, or even people hiding, find funny. And what I found was this, that the humor created from away from the front lines, away from the occupation, but very much aware of what's going on, is very angry, is very I don't know. It's angry at politicians. It's angry at the war itself, and it's devastatingly cruel and graphic. Songs and jokes created in Kazakhstan, they savor the details of how exactly Nazis should be killed. And, we should make this kind of sausage from them. We should make this kind of belts from their skin. There's a lot of that kind of humor, a lot of toilet humor. And, I keep reminding myself that these are kids, young people living through all this, creating this kind of humor. And, they find toilet humor funny. It's just that they have to, they're living through the Holocaust, and they apply that to their reality. So, if they're far, the humor laughs. The butt of the joke is kind of more abstract army. If they're living within the persecution, the laughter is more at themselves. I also want to say that Soviets made quite a bit of effort collecting humor. And there have been a lot of studies. We talked a little bit about this at the beginning, about using humor as a weapon in the war. All governments were super interested in this. British government, Soviet government, of course, Soviet government was really interested in controlling what goes to people, to soldiers, to civilians, kind of motivational humor and stuff like this. But what ends up happening during the war is that the governments tend to censor humor more rather than actually supporting creators of it. Why? Because for humor to be funny, for jokes to be relevant, they have to be self-deprecating at least somewhat. And that is, of course, not possible in the condition of the war. You laugh at, the governments want you to laugh at the enemy as opposed to at oneself. And then suddenly you get unpatriotic humor as opposed to the one that helps you fight. So I've seen variations of that as well. And of course, humor created in the United States, very far from the war, during the war is very different too. So Avi mentioned Ernst Lubitsch's To Be or Not to Be. To me, it's like a wonderful example of a humorous piece created by people who truly care about what's going on in Europe. Everyone, like some of the most important people involved in the creation of this film are Jewish, right? And family members left behind, but even they like don't know yet who's in bigger danger. Is it Polish people who are being occupied? There's the Jews who live there. What do we laugh at? Do we laugh at this misfortunate Jewish comedian who is the only one who actually kind of endangered towards the end of the movie, or do we laugh at Hitler or representation of Hitler and this kind of stuff? So there is a little bit more room for creativity and imagination if one is far, whereas when one is near, humor plays a very different role.
Growing up in Jerusalem in the 1960s and 70s, I remember that we told a lot of Holocaust jokes. And it was not, now I know, but I didn't understand then, it was not only about the Germans, it was also to differentiate between us, born in Israel, and the survivors. There was a kind of a hierarchy. Right. About Jewish humor, I think for humor, it's better to be a persecuted minority than a powerful nation state. In general, for humor. So that's about Israeli humor. And so we have a question about that I'd like to pose to you, because it's really connected to what we are speaking. Verena Arndt asks, how exactly would we define Jewish humor? Isn't the assumption that there is a typical Jewish kind of humor a sort of stereotype? And I would add, maybe by Jewish humor, do we mean Yiddish humor, East European humor? That's what we have in mind.
You want me to start, or you want to start?
Yeah, you start.
Okay, I'll start. So I appreciate the question. It's a good question because there's a number of factors to consider. So first of all, I teach. So at University of Connecticut, I teach a class that's called Jewish Humor. So and it as people might imagine, it enrolls pretty well. It's a pretty popular class because students can't believe that they get to just watch things or read things and decide if they're funny and then analyze, right? That's the joke about, analyzing humor is like dissecting a frog. The frog dies and there's nothing funny about it. But anyway, it assumes that there is a category of Jewish humor because we have a class, but we spend a lot of the class, to Verena's question, we spend a lot of the class debating and analyzing whether it's a useful analytical category, because it's actually quite hard to, we assume it. I've been using this constantly, this notion of Jewish humor says this, Jewish humor does that I can define it. But there are so many different examples that challenge the category itself, right? So there are certain things that I, and I happen to have it here because we're using in my class, Jeremy Dauber's book, Jewish Comedy, A Serious History. So Jeremy has 7 categories that he uses to define what is Jewish humor, some which I've referred to kind of humor that responds to persecution, although as Alon pointed out, it's very different to be sort of persecuted or self-perception of a persecuted minority that uses self-deprecation to deal with that minority status, as opposed to sort of being a group in power, right? That changes the whole dynamic. But also, humor that deals with everyday life, or humor that deals with specifically Jewish norms, humor that's created by Jews, or humor that's directed at a Jewish audience. But then that gets us into the tricky bit of sort of, the things that are outliers, right? So when John Mulaney who's now divorced from his ex-Jewish wife, tells jokes about his ex-wife, like, is that Jewish humor or not, right? It changes the dynamic to a certain extent. The question of like dealing in stereotypes, I think, is really important, right? Because humor needs stereotypes, right? Like, you need to set up sort of you don't have time to deal with this analysis that we're doing. You have to set up characters. You have to set up the Jewish mother. You have to set up the Jewish wife, the Jewish son, whatever it is, right? There's the rabbi, and you have to deal in stereotypes. The last thing I'll say about this that I think is interesting that we haven't touched upon as much yet is the boundaries between what's considered Jewish humor and what's considered anti-Semitism. And that is a very thin line, again, depending on who's telling the joke and what the audience is. And certainly in our current climate where we see, 2021 is the most incidents of anti-Semitism that have been counted in the last decade. It's and all sorts of Holocaust denial and distortion running rampant and anti-vaxxer debates. It's very different to talk about humor that invokes the Holocaust in this climate than it is, 5-10 years ago, right? Things feel different. So I think the boundaries are constantly shifting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree with that for sure. And it is very different to talk about this now. And I also want to say, I also will share the experience from teaching of Jewish humor. I'm a specialist in Yiddish literature. So, I've been teaching Shalom Aleichem for a very long time. And until I decided that it was too much for me. Every year, increasingly, students enrolled in those classes, mostly Jewish students, complained about Shalom Aleichem being anti-Semitic. They couldn't handle Shalom Aleichem. All Jews in Shalom Aleichem were weak, were funny, were physically, they've never went to gym, they were poor. Canadian Jewish students couldn't imagine, an impoverished man from a shtetl who's like trying to make a living. And they said, well, this is stereotypes, that's how he just said. These are like things that are not true. Why would he studying anti-Semitic literature? So honestly, I switched to parrots because Yud Lamed parrots, those who are familiar, is much better, much more universally understood. It's all about, romanticism, God is everywhere. So it's perfect. Everyone loves parrots. And then my teaching assignments shifted a little bit, and now I almost never teach courses on Yiddish literature only, unfortunately, but I teach a discipline called diaspora studies. Diaspora studies deals with cultures of, diasporas, immigrants from everywhere. So I decided to try Shalom Aleichem in that class. That class has mostly students who are kids of immigrants. And oh my God, Shalom Aleichem was a huge hit. Students from all over the world. Toronto, we're blessed of having like extremely multicultural, a diverse city. My students' parents come from Bangladesh, from Egypt, from Iran, from Pakistan. Like they have universally loved Shalom Aleichem. Why? Because their parents speak exactly like this. And they say, well, this is the humor we understand. This is how my dad complains about things. This is how my mom replies to him. And everything in Shalom Aleichem resonated. So for me, actually, it helped me understand the nature of Jewish humor a lot better, because Jewish humor is the humor of a minority, of an impoverished minority, often first or second generation immigrants. That's where it speaks to. And when I, talked about this, sometimes people said, but how did they understand all the nuances of, Jewish daily life, observances, and, there are all these holidays and stuff. That is very easy to explain. It's much harder to get the actual essence of that humor. And Shalom Aleichem spoke to those kids a lot better than it did to Jews. But I do also want to say about some of the problematic aspects of universal Jewish humor discussion. When I came to Oxford to work on my grad degree, and I met somebody from the States who told me a Jap joke. I had no idea what that meant. And even when, the explanation of abbreviation was given, Jewish American princess, I still didn't understand what it meant. When I watched Woody Allen's film about Jewish mom, what's it called, The New York Stories, I couldn't understand why it was funny. The ideas of Jewish American princes and Jewish American moms, these are American Jewish ideas. These are not universal Jewish humor. It doesn't make any sense. So now I understand it a little bit better because I lived in the West for a long time. My sister, who's my generation, who lives in Moscow, I tried to explain Jap to her. She doesn't understand. She says, but that's anti-Semitic. And I said, well, actually, when Jews say it, it's not. Well, anyway, so to me, that debate actually is it's what you just said, Alon. It's like this whole hierarchy, survivors versus sabras, who gets the joke and who doesn't. If you are a certain generation, certain class, and certain position in a society, you may get some of those Jewish jokes, but it doesn't make them necessarily universal or Jewish, for what it's worth.
These are wonderful insights, what both of you said, that what Avinoam said, that now it's not always clear whether a joke is anti-Semitic or not, or what are the lines between telling a joke and anti-Semitism. And what Anna said, that actually in the culture in which we live, in which we are so cautious not to offend any group, which we, in some universities, we have to put triggers in our syllabus just so the students will not be offended. So Jewish students read Shalom Aleichem and they think he's anti-Semitic. So we also lost something in our good will not to offend. Well, humor sometimes offends, actually many times offends. That's part of what humor is to laugh at yourself and at others. So this line between when it is anti-Semitism, when you can joke about yourself, that's very, very interesting. I'd like to take another question by Christina Neuhaus, who is asking about taboos and humor when it comes to who is allowed to joke about the topic. So a Jewish versus a Gentile joking about a topic probably makes a difference, but do these differences also exist within the Jewish community by survivors versus later generations or the like? So in some ways, Anna already started to speak about it.
Well, I could just say one thing, and then I'll let Avi provide a longer answer about the survivors. There is a survivor in Toronto whose name is Eli Gotz. He's a survivor of Kovno Ghetto, and he wrote a wonderful book about his experiences too. And Eli has been doing a lot of Holocaust education for high school, so he gives, he talks to kids about his experiences. And in his talk, he often tells the following story, that at some point his family didn't know if they were going to be deported or not, and they didn't want to be deported. And the mom said, his mom was a nurse, and she said, if they deport us, then I'm going to get some poison and I will inject poison to all of us because we would rather die than go on the deportation. And then she got that poison and they were about to start the injection. So she took the cotton ball with alcohol and sanitized the area of the arm before injecting that needle. And Eli said to her, he tells that story, "Mom, you're about to inject poison. Why are you sanitizing the skin?" And the mom says, "I don't know. That's how we always do it." Anyway, and then he moves on to talk about something else. So I think that's a very wonderful story with a lot of humor, and that resonated with me for sure. But so many complaints against him of inappropriateness of that story for school kids flew from school boards that it became a story in itself. So that, I think, kind of begins this conversation, at least for my part, of Christina Newhouse, that just asked about, survivors versus non-survivors talking about humor. But I'm curious what Avi has to say about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting example, and I think the question itself is a good question, because as we've been talking about, it really matters, right? You have to really pay attention to who's telling the joke and how are they telling the joke and why are they telling the joke, you know. And I'm struck by, it's interesting. So my kids know that this is something I'm interested in. This is something that I do. And so from time to time, one of my son, who's 14, will show me something that he's come across on TikTok, and they'll be like, "Oh, Holocaust joke," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's a completely anti-Semitic sort of joke that is," but it's everywhere, right? So, there are a lot of examples of this. And one of the dividing lines is sort of this question of, is this a type of humor that minimizes or trivializes suffering of Jews during the war? Which unfortunately is what a lot of the stuff that people come across online are, those types of cheap, like jokes that we see in a lot of cases. What's interesting is, so one of the contributors to the book is Fern Perlstein, who created what I think is a wonderful documentary called The Last Laugh. And in The Last Laugh, she does something really, really interesting, which is she follows a Holocaust survivor from LA, her name is Renee Firestone, who's actually one of the survivors who I think there's the Shoah Foundation has created sort of a, New Dimensions and Testimony virtual survivor of Renee. And she sort of is a survivor who has a good sense of humor, but she has Renee, like in the documentary, watch different things and talk about whether or not she finds this amusing. So Sarah Silverman is a perfect example, right? Like there's a clip in the movie where she's watching Sarah Silverman tell a joke about the Holocaust, and it's actually a joke about sort of 6 million. She corrects her niece who says, "Oh, 60 million Jews died in the Holocaust," and she says, "No, it's 6 million." And her niece says, "Oh, what's the difference?" And Sarah Silverman says, "Well, the difference is that 60 million would be unforgivable." Now, Renee in the documentary says, "I don't think that's funny," right? And it's a very interesting sort of dynamic that she explores there, which is who gets to tell what jokes. And that's a joke that Sarah Silverman is telling about sort of, maybe reconciliation, Wiedergutmachung, like at what point do you sort of make up for, how do you decide? It's actually a complicated thing that she uses humor for. Renee, in her analysis of it, is like, that's not funny, right? So it's also very, very subjective as to who finds what funny. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about humor. It's very, very subjective, right? Like we sort of can decide what we do or do not find funny, although it's quite revealing then to think about what we do or do not consider funny.
So there is an interesting question here, Barik Vitale. He wants to look at earlier Jewish catastrophes. He asked whether there is Jewish humor during the Spanish Inquisition. Well, I'm not so sure that historians can answer this. Maybe not us. But is there Jewish humor, for example, during the pogroms in the Ukraine from 1919 to 1922?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, I was just going to say.
Shalom Aleichem. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, of course. But Shalom Aleichem is about immigration. It's not really about the pogroms were serious.
Well, but think about like the last story in Lech Lecha and the Tevye stories. I mean, there's pogrom jokes. But anyway, go ahead, and then I want to say something about that too. But go ahead,
you were
Anna.
going to say about Bloody Hoax. That's Shalom Aleicham's novel about that deals with pogrom. That's not what I was thinking about, although now I have to think about that too. So here's what I think about that. Like, I'm sure there are some of those Spanish Inquisition things going somewhere, but you have to kind of know to understand. But I will give you an example from the Russian culture. So pogroms. One of the biggest atrocities of pogroms was, of course, sexual violence. Sexual violence is something that people don't talk about. It's one of the most traumatic events that can happen to a person, but it's also one of the most tabooized topic for discussion. So, of course, in some places, as many as 70% of Jewish women were raped in like one locations during those pogroms. So, of course, that's part of history, but so what's with the humor? And what happened was that the memory is suppressed, public discussion is suppressed, everything is suppressed. The only thing where things like this emerge is humor. I give you an example. In the Russian language culture, tons of jokes about rape, tons of jokes. So for example, a joke like, like a pogromist goes into the house and, and says to the family, all women come out, I'm going to rape you all. And the father stands up, locks the door and says, no, 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 you can't take my life, just don't touch my girls. And he is really kind of like unattractive looking daughter comes out behind him, pushes him aside and says, Papa, pogrom is a pogrom, right? That's a joke that is widespread. And I can tell you a lot, many of them as well. Where does that come from? It comes from that historical memory that only survives in those tabooized jokes. And of course, changes the culture as well. So I'm sure if we look for things like that from Spanish Inquisition, from among Spanish speakers, among Ladino speakers, maybe it will come up, but I'm not sure. But for Russian ones, I have that example.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, and why I'm so happy we're doing this conversation together, is to think about like what is very, so, and this goes back to the question about what's Jewish humor, what's very culturally specific about certain kinds of jokes. Like as you started on in sort of the idea of that some kinds of humor don't travel, some kinds of humor don't translate, some kinds of humor are very specific to certain cultural contexts. I mean, I think it makes it like a really interesting question to explore. What's the Yiddish humor of Jews of Eastern Europe? When does this emerge? 19th century examples that we're talking about here. What's specific to Jewish life in the former Soviet Union? What's specific to America, Israel? What's interesting, and this is, thinking back to the Jewish humor question, like there are certain motifs in Jewish tradition. So the Purim story is a perfect example, right? Of like the idea of a comic inversion that actually becomes, so it's, attempted genocide, and then the last laugh is that the evil one is the one who ends up getting hung at the end. Now, this is a very sort of familiar comedy, right? That the victims get the last laugh at the end. It may not be a specifically Jewish form of comedy, but it does become kind of part of Jewish tradition. And I think that in a lot of cases, to answer the question, you will see, so for example, like Dayenu is part of Pesach, in the Haggadah, you will see sort of verses that are added in where you can situate historical events into kind of a Jewish conception of how history works. So, this like shorthand for Jewish holidays, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. And then you kind of situate different historical experiences that Jews have into that understanding of this is how the world works. Or, like it's very interesting. There's a Haggadah that's created by survivors after the war that situates like all the different catastrophes and the persecutions into Dayenu. Like it would have been enough if all these things had happened. And it's comical in a sense, but it also is situated in a very Jewish sort of understanding of how the world works. So I imagine that if we look hard enough, we'll find, among the sort of diaspora of Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal, some comic sort of interpretations of that experience that are situated within a broader Jewish religious framework. Just a hunch.
I think about the photographs that you showed us, Avi, at the beginning of Hitler in Purim. And when I think about my childhood, no one dressed up as Hitler, but we did have a bonfire in which we burned Hitler. And this was very common. And I don't think today also in Israel, no one dresses up. There is a taboo. There is a limit to what you can dress up. When I was a kid, some kids dressed up as Nasser, the president of Egypt at the time. But I dressed up in high school to Jesus. I think this is also these days in Israel. Well, it's not going to work out. So we have a question by Alexandra Ozer, who is a scholar who teaches in France and who works on a project on jokes in the Third Reich. And she asks, some of the examples we have given are from professionals, artists, writers, singers, people that use humor in their profession or cultural activity. Do you think there is a difference with ordinary people's humor or jokes? And if yes, what kind of differences are there? Is there a different kind of taboos for ordinary people and for professionals? And if yes, what kind of differences?
Yeah, I like this question. You know, as you were talking about sort of dressing up as Hitler in the DP camps for Purim, I mean, this, just to reference that for a second, the descriptions of that Purim in the Landsberg DP camp, I mean, they're putting Hitler on trial, they're burning Hitler in effigy, like it is this sort of great celebration of the, and I think you're right? I don't know if people remember when Prince Harry, you know, dressed up and went to a costume party and wore a swastika. I mean, that was, he got a lot, he got in a lot of trouble for that, right? If people remember this example. So to this really, really interesting question about the distinction that Alexandra has, the distinction between performers, artists, writers, singers, and ordinary people. So I think this again gets back to sort of audience, cultural expression, intent. You know, in the volume, there are a couple of scholars who look at, I think, what we can think of as like the humor of like everyday jokes, which is one of the challenges, is a little harder to collect, right? Like everyday humor. But Liat Steyer-Livni, for example, has a chapter where she looks at Anne Frank jokes on Twitter. And it's actually, I think it's a brilliant sort of way to kind of analyze like every day. It's a great, you know, repository, Facebook, Twitter, like where people are, Reddit, where you see crazy, crazy things, and people are ordinary, we'll call it ordinary people, are just posting stuff. And I think this is a way to get a sense for how people are telling jokes. And in Liat's chapter, she sees like the ways in which kind of Anne Frank is used as a symbol. People will make all kinds of jokes. Liat subsequently did sort of an analysis of people in, for example, in Israel under quarantine, making Anne Frank jokes, right? So again, these are not jokes that are making light of the suffering of Anne Frank, although maybe they'll be interpreted that way. It's more about sort of kind of processing and coping with the difficulties of living under quarantine, for example. So I think it is interesting. I think there's a difference. You know, one of the other things that I think is interesting, and there's a chapter in the book about jokes that third generation, so grandchildren of Holocaust survivors tell, which is a really interesting sort of a chapter that analyzes like inside, what we would call insider humor versus, you know, does it pass from one generation to the next? Are there certain jokes that survivors can tell only amongst themselves that outsiders wouldn't get? And are there certain jokes that children of survivors or grandchildren of survivors tell to each other? And then how does the telling of that joke reinforce sort of that expression of, this is my identity, this is who I am, because I tell these kind of jokes, because I get these kind of jokes. It's a very dark kind of humor, but it's also a way of sort of processing what's handed down, but also expressing that this is part of my identity. So, and I would put this in the category of like everyday, you know, jokes that are told as part of one's experience.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the materials that I work with, they were all collected by ethnographers from, or folklorists from people, that this is jokes that circulated. However, of course, they were not working exactly, I don't know, in the atmosphere of academic freedom. They were working in Stalin's Soviet Union. So who knows what they could actually write down of those jokes that they've heard. Maybe they made some of that up themselves, you know, who knows. But at least the one thing we know for sure, that these pieces circulated during the war itself and were not created after. So to me, that's a huge insight of these materials. But there's always a question is, did professional jokers or the professional artists influence what circulated? And I think the answer to that, yes, but in the case of, I don't know, Holocaust in the Soviet Union, hard to say, because very few getters there had professional theaters. Vilna Ghetto did, but you know, others didn't. And I realized I moved us away from you know, post-war, but right back into during the war. But during the war, that's a challenge. And my material is specifically so attractive to me because that's what circulated among people, rather than something that was brought to them.
Avi and Anna, are there any final words that you would like to say? There's so much more to say. We can go on forever, but we have to finish. And I apologize for the people who asked questions and we couldn't answer. So would you like to say some final words? You don't have to.
I'll just say that I want to thank you for hosting us. You know, it's a really interesting sort of discussion, and I'm grateful to you for you know, making this part of our International Holocaust Remembrance Day program. I think, you know, what I hope is that as people continue to sort of pay attention to this topic, you will see it come up in all sorts of different ways, all sorts of different environments. I think the stakes will only continue to get higher as we, you know, distance from the Holocaust grows over time, as we see, you know, increasing levels, I think, of denial and distortion. It doesn't mean that we're going to stop seeing this kind of humor. You know, I'm thinking about this most recent season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, where in one of the last episodes, Larry goes into a Holocaust museum in Los Angeles and walks out wearing a pair of shoes from an exhibit. If people haven't seen it, you'll see it. So I think we'll continue to see this. And I think part of it is also understanding the ways in which it is not just thinking about the historical events of the Holocaust, but also thinking about the place of the Holocaust in, you know, contemporary life. And so it'll be interesting to see how this topic continues to grow and develop.
I agree. I want to say thank you for hosting us. Ashenem Dank. I have to say something in Yiddish now. And I have to say that I really appreciate the fact that you bring this topic up and you give us an opportunity to give voice to people who were joking during the war. You know, Avi's work is about humor, including things about humor in DP camps, and my work too about Jews joking and getters. I think those people deserve to be heard, and it's really important that we talk about this. And thank you so much, Alon, for making it happen.
So I'd like to end with a joke. It's a joke that begins my book, A World Without Jews. A group of Nazis surrounded an elderly Berlin Jew and demanded of him, "Tell us, Jew, who caused the war?" The little Jew was no fool. "The Jews," he answered. Then added, "And the bicycle riders." The Nazis were puzzled. "Why the bicycle riders?" "Why the Jews?" answered the old man. So thank you so much. And
thank you, Alon.
Have a good evening. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you. Good night.